Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Yeah, you're a scientist. So I was thinking humans are like big dumb, but we we still manage to like get science done, even with like all of our stupid like psychological quirks and cognitive biases and stuff. So I was thinking like there's a lot of talk about like the way people do like fallacious arguments on the internet. And I was like, what cognitive biases are the biggest impact in science? Like what would you say? Because that there's no way to definitively rank that, but you're a scientist, so definitively rank this for me. What would you say are the top five, like these things that human brains do will have the biggest impact on science?
Well, darn it, Lions, I'm a chemist, not a sociologist, but with my very limited knowledge and very limited expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. You did say that humans, we attempt science. And when you said that, the first thing that came to my mind was we attempt science like Wile E. Coyote tries to catch a roadrunner. You know, like a lot of the times we're just like, hey, man, maybe this will work. And sometimes the cognitive biases help because they happen to bias us in the correct direction. But that's not good science. It's just, you know, you got
luck.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, oh my God, I found 5 pennies, all heads up. I am the master of finding heads up pennies. And it's like, nope, got lucky. But I mean, or, you know, or it's like in Rick and Morty, it's like, I'm acid proof. Oh my God.
The way that guy handles that is concerning.
I know, right? It's like, sounds like that guy had some other stuff going on. So with that in mind, I have taken my personal, as you kind of mentioned, because it's hard to definitively do this, my personal top 5. And I also had 3 honorable mentions, because what I did in order to do this was I went through the Wikipedia article on cognitive biases and wrote down all of the ones I thought would have an impact. And I came up with 22.
Is that
it? The problem is, and I am just a scientist, but 22 is greater than 5. And so I realized, I was like, well, some of these are bad because they have really bad sociological implications and societal implications, but they're not really bad for experimentation per se. So I actually saved those in a different list. So we can go over those at another time. So I whittled down the top 5 and I was like, some of these other ones are worth at least mentioning. So with all of that in mind, for our listeners who may not know, what is a cognitive bias?
How would I define that? So it's when your brain is more likely to go toward a specific conclusion, sort of like regardless of other information that might steer you otherwise, right? So your example, I am the master of finding heads up pennies, I think would be maybe like a confirmation bias, where it's like, because I did find 5 heads up pennies, I must be able to find heads up pennies, right? Like you're just assuming there's like a causation because of correlation.
Yes.
Yeah. So that kind of thing is like, even if you presented that to someone like, well, that doesn't mean you're just good at finding heads up pennies, but they're like, oh, but I did it, but I found them, right? Like that's the bias part happening, is like the struggle to acknowledge the evidence before you, because your brain is like, no, it must be this other way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Is when your brain leans you in a direction that is not supported by the data, you know? So, one of the ways that was described to me that really helped was whenever you say the phrase, no, that sounds right, what you're actually saying is that confirms my existing biases, you know, which is a wildly different statement, right? But the problem is that we can't sit there and pore over data and make completely perfectly cognizant decisions for every single thing that we do. Nothing would ever get done. So there's sometimes where you just kind of have to be like, yeah, given all of my existing biases and the way I think that the world works, that conforms to that. So that's probably right. You know?
Well, and I feel like I remember hearing at some point that, you know, if you associate rustling in the bushes with tiger attacks, then that not everything that makes the bushes rustle is a tiger, but humans who had a bias towards like, rustling, it must be a tiger, were maybe more likely to not get mauled to death by a tiger, instead of being like, oh, what is that rustling in the bushes over there? I'm going to go investigate. So in the early point of humanity, we probably selected for some of the unhappiness we now have in our brains trying to do science.
Absolutely, because what I've said a number of times is that like our brains were made to be correlation machines. To use your example, right, is that like when they heard the rustling in the bushes and they were like, "Hey, there was a time when rustling in the bushes was a tiger." So whenever I hear rustling in the bushes, I assume tiger, which is actually negativity bias, which didn't even make the list. Um, but yeah, so that's what our brains were made to do. And then we were like, hey, well, what if we tried to do science with it? And evolution said, I didn't make this for that. It's like, but I think I can make it work. That's we're exactly right. So
is that an optimism bias? I got this.
Actually, no, that's a different bias, which I kind of touch on a little bit. So there is a ton of them. There's at least 22 that I thought were impactful. But at the bottom of the hour, we will talk about the honorable mentions. So one of them that I wanted to talk about is conformity bias. Would you like to take a passive? So we'll do this so we're both participating. I'll name it. You tell me what you think it was, and then I'll tell you how close you got, and then I'll go over some examples and why it's bad.
Conformity bias definitely sounds like you are just doing what the group is doing. So if I could imagine that being impactful in science because you are kind of looking for new knowledge. So if you are just assuming that you already know everything and that the group already has the wisdom, then like how would you then acknowledge evidence that ran counter to the wisdom of the group? That would be non-conforming.
You got it, man. Yeah, pretty much tends across the board, right? So the conformity bias is the tendency to conform to the group or mean, right? So yeah, so basically is that, you're all looking at a picture and John says, well, I think that picture's a rabbit. And everybody goes, yes, rabbit, yes. So example number one is bandwagon or groupthink, which is why a lot of the times, even in management situations, they're like, hey, this is a thing where we need to get each individual contributor's thoughts on it, and then we will all discuss it, as opposed to having, manager John say, oh, well, I think thing A, and then our social, and again, like I think that, and this is where this is just my belief, right? My existing bias is that like humans are inherently very social creatures. And so because if we don't work together as a group, we all die, right? So being kicked out of the group is a death sentence, So if everybody says thing A and you're the only person saying thing B, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. That's going to get you killed. So we have this kind of built into us. Additionally is courtesy bias, which is the tendency to give a more socially correct opinion than the true opinion to avoid offense, which I thought is kind of interesting, right? Where it's like, instead of saying, that person's bad at their job, you're like, how would I say this? They are doing as well as I would expect somebody with that skill set to be performing in those conditions.
Yeah.
Right.
I just recently heard a version of that I really like, which is instead of telling someone, I told you so, you can say, this was predicted as a likely outcome early on.
I also, sorry, this is wildly afield, but somebody said, because I often say live in the dream, and somebody said, I saw somebody where it says like, instead of saying this, say this. And I'm like, those two aren't the same sentiment at all, but I want to start saying the other thing, which is instead of saying living the dream, you say the horrors persist and so do I.
Yes, those are super not the same thing, but I do like the fanciness of the second one.
Yeah, right. But yeah, so that one got an honorable mention. And it's bad because, as you kind of mentioned, it stagnates progress, right? So, basically once somebody says, I believe the cause of A is B, and everybody goes, yes, that makes sense. Then all of a sudden, best case scenario, you spend a whole bunch of time and energy trying to prove or disprove B, instead of going for the other thing, which very easily could have saved you a lot of time, energy, and effort, right? So that one got an honorable mention. The next one is availability heuristic.
Ooh.
What do you think that one is?
Ooh.
Right? It's got heuristic in the name, and I was like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm going to say that is an assumption that the measurements you've taken or the information you have available, like, over generalizes, like, oh, I surveyed these 3 people who happen to be proximate to me. That probably represents all of New York City.
That would actually probably be a subsection of this. It's like, that's like, for the version of it I'm looking at, you're like 90% of the way there, right? which is availability heuristic is you overestimate the likelihood of events with greater availability in memory. So
Oh,
like,
okay.
yeah, so similar but a little bit different. And the interesting thing is that can be influenced by recentness or unusually or emotionally charged memories, right?
Yes. So I actually am familiar with this from an exploitative standpoint. I did not know this is what it was called. But if you are trying to communicate information to someone, like you're giving a presentation or making a speech or something, that you structure it with you have a strong opening somewhere in the middle, depending on how long the middle is, you would need like 1 to 3 strong emotional moments and then a strong closing because you spoke for an hour, but there's these 5 things is what they're actually going to remember. And so you tailor what you're saying to like kind of pull on that bias. And this can be used for evil. I have not intentionally used this for evil, but like you can put the negative parts, the things you don't want people to remember, sandwiched in like the trough of forgetfulness and like really, really construct a speech in kind of a malicious way.
And the thing that I liked about this one too is not to break my arm, pat myself on the back, but so one of the things that we use a lot of times is like when something goes sideways, we document it, right? And then we use a Pareto chart that kind of lists out which instances of bad things have happened with what frequency, right? And one of the things I would always say when people would be like, oh, well, I don't need that, is I would always say, if you ask somebody what is the number one problem that you're dealing with, you are going to get the most recent problem or the most annoying problem, but not the biggest problem. And that's basically everybody operating with the availability heuristic, right? Because they're like, oh, well, I'll tell you what the problem is. It's my desk chair not being at exactly the right height. That's the problem. It's like, no, that's just really annoying. And thus it is in the forefront of your mind. So you're like, oh, well, that must be the problem everywhere. And it's like, no, actually, out of 20 iterations, that happened once, but because it was such a big deal, everybody's like, oh my god, we have to spend a bunch of time, energy, and what have you on this. Some other examples of it are the Bader-Meinhof effect. Yeah, which I know care to share that one with the group?
Yeah, that's when you suddenly become aware of something because it matters to you now. So the quintessential example is you get a blue car and suddenly you feel like everyone has a blue car because the general population has the same number of blue cars they had before you had a blue car, but now you are looking for blue cars because you have a blue car.
Absolutely, right? Where all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, everybody's copying me. And it's like, nope, you just became aware of this, right? Availability heuristic. Also, another example of it, which I was not as familiar with, is anthropocentric thinking, which is the tendency to use human analogies with less familiar biological phenomena that in no way resemble humans, right? So, for example, viruses are evil or bacteria want to get inside your body. They don't want anything. Humans want things,
that happened in this conversation. You anthropomorphized evolution.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I just did it for lulz.
Yes, you were speaking hyperbolically for the lulz.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's why it wasn't a legitimate mistake. It was for the lulz for sure. And so why is this bad? It causes bad initial assumptions or framing and then causes waste of time, right? Because then basically, if you're just kind of like, oh, well, the reason why this science experiment isn't working is because the lights are always flickering on and off. That must be the issue. So now you're going to spend a bunch of time, energy, and effort trying to fix the lights when that's in no way impactful to the actual experiment as a whole, right? So has a lot of problems all over the place, which is why you need to gather data, right? But to go back to what we're talking about is if somebody suddenly said like, oh man, the problem is all the lights flickering on and off. That's the reason why people are quitting this place. And you might say, yeah, that makes sense. And, which means it's
biases all the way down.
Exactly. Right. So the final honorable mention, and then we'll get into number 5. The final is called extension neglect, which I almost made this one. I was flipping back and forth between this one being an actual number 5, because I do think it's something that happens all the time. But I was just like, I think number 5 is a little bit worse. So what do you think extension neglect is? I'm not giving you a lot to go on. There's not a lot of context clues.
These names are getting... the first one felt like, oh, those are just normal words that a regular person would use. Then availability heuristic, and now extension neglect. So I'm gonna take it at face value and just say it is like ignoring things outside like the immediate observation or like the immediate thing. Like there's a context that you're throwing away that obviously has an impact on the system or the measurement or whatever.
Yeah, actually, that's given the very little bit of information you got, as close as I think anyone could have hoped to have gotten. Right?
I'll take it.
Yeah, which is when the quantity of the sample size is not taken into account when assessing the outcome. So when it's just to your point, right, where it's like, oh my God, I found 3 pennies. I am the master of finding pennies. It's like you found 3 out of 10 billion, like that's not a huge thing. So, for example, thing A must be good or right because I spoke with 5 people, despite the fact that 10,000 people said it to the contrary, right? Or another one that can be, really problematic is like, oh, well, we've got, John Doe who believes that climate change is a fake, and we've got Jane Doe who believes that it's real. And it's like, well, John Doe represents like 1,000 scientists. And oh my God, 1,000 scientists. Jane Doe represents 3 billion scientists.
All of the others.
Yes. So like we're like, oh well, those 2 things are about equal. It's like, no, it's not even close. But the fact that you're like, oh, but it's 2 things. It's only 2 things, and it's like, no, it's not proportionally weighted. Additionally, scope neglect or an instant, and I thought this was interesting because this is something that I think we all tend to do, and I was like, oh, it's good to know that this fits into this category, which is the insensitivity to the size of a problem. So spending the same amount of money, for example, is trying to say, like, you're like, oh man, we've got to save people's lives. That's great. So I'm going to spend $10,000 on this project. Great. But that $10,000 just saved 2,000 lives. You could have spent the same amount of money to save 20,000 lives if you solved this other problem. A good example of that is tuberculosis, right? Tuberculosis is a huge disease, not necessarily in like the US where we have medicine for it, but in developing nations for sure. And it would take a trivial amount of money to fix that problem. But instead we're like, oh, well, we've got to fix this other problem because we can see it, and that will save 10,000 lives. It's like you would save 10 million lives if you spent that money over here. So that is scope neglect, which is an extension of extension neglect.
Sad.
So, yeah, right. Some of these are going to be sad because
yes,
bad science unfortunately impacts the entire world, right? So number 5, it is the G.I. Joe fallacy.
Oh Lord.
Do you even want to make an attempt? You want to pass on this one?
No, I want to make an attempt because the first place that my brain went was like imagining like an outsized impact from an individual contributor, right? Because like the army is like millions of people and the G.I. Joes are like a dozen soldiers, right? So that was the first place my brain went, is like, oh, you have this one superhero they'll solve the problem, or that this one thing changes everything, that kind of thing.
Again, very close given the information. Is that
means these were named well?
Yeah, right. I think that the only difference is you focused externally. This focuses internally, which is that the G.I. Joe is the tendency to think that knowing about a bias makes you immune to the bias.
Ah, yes. Because knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe.
Yes. Okay. I like that. I like that name for that. That's good.
That clearly got branding after the TV show, right? Yes. And they were like, "Oh, hey, I think this is a bias." They're making the G.I. Joe theme song, and they're like, "We're knowing is half the battle," and the scientist is like, "That's a cognitive bias. Like, stop teaching people that."
Well, this is a bunch of people saying like, "It's half the battle. You have to do the other half of the battle."
There's still half the battle to be fought, right? So the reason why I put this as number 5. So sorry, an example of this would be an easy one is pharmacists and drugs, right? pharmacists have one of the higher rates of drug abuse, and it's mostly because they're pharmacists. They know all of the effects of the drugs, and therefore the drugs they can't become addicted. I can't become addicted because I know what addiction looks like. And it's like, no, you totally can, G.I. Joe. And so the why is this bad is because this causes a extraordinary false sense of security, right? Because all of the time, and I deal with this regularly in my job, which may be why this hedged out the other one for number 5, because it was the most emotionally impactful, which was it appealed to my availability heuristic, right? Half of this is just meta commentary on me making the list and all the biases that impacted me while I made it. Yeah, this is exhausting.
That's a third list.
The third list is talking about the first list, but we'd have to have you do the third list, so that way it was a peer review. Anyways, but yeah, no, is that like so often we all deal with people, but I particularly deal with people at work where, like they'll say like, oh, well, person A is just suffering from this bias or logical fallacy or what have you. And it's like, so anyways, we need to go do thing B. And it's like that is the exact same problem. They're like, well, I mean, that's not going to happen to me. And it's just like, no, you are as susceptible as everyone else. We all are. So that's why we have peer review, because it's like, oh, well, I would never do anything unethical. And it's like, yeah, you would, given the right constraints, you would. So it's good to have a secondary review, so we deal with that one quite a bit. So number 4, the curse of knowledge.
Ooh, I feel like I just recently heard someone use this colloquially. Is the curse of knowledge when you like kind of spiral because you already know a lot about the domain, and so you are like going off into avenues that are technically related because you have the knowledge to like make those connections, but that they're not directly like necessary for what you're trying to do. So I'm thinking like if you were trying to like bake a cake, like where I live in the mountains, and you started to freak out about like, oh, but at altitude and the way the atmospheric pressure is measured is different, and like you're like spiraling because you have this like deep knowledge, but it's like, yeah, but all you have to do is know to bake the cake a little hotter for a little longer. And it's like all of that other stuff is like technically true, but you have like spiraled off.
Yeah, I think that would be maybe like an affect of this, So like, I think that what you're describing could fall under the curse of knowledge, or come like you have the curse of knowledge and then that other thing happens. But more specifically it's that better informed people find it extremely difficult to think about problems from less informed people, from their point of view.
Yes, I think is this also called like it's like the master bias or the expert bias or something.
It might. I mean, all like that sounds right.
Yes,
it confirms my existing biases. Yeah.
Hey, we did it again.
Yep.
Yes. This is actually. I'm glad I now know the official definition for that one, because this is a thing I have to do in my line of work, is when someone is talking about like a problem they have, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen that problem a million times. It's like, don't do that. Like let them explain their situation. You must assume there is information here you don't already have. Otherwise, when it comes by, you will just let it pass you by. You'd be like, oh yeah, I already know all this.
Yep, exactly. And on top of that, it can cause, so I'll say why it's bad. Yes, that is one of the reasons why it is bad. One of the examples that I had for this is a while back, I got a phone call from a concerned citizen, and they were up in arms because they had just found out that that nobody was analyzing for hexavalent chromium in their drinking water. And hexavalent chromium is the stuff that Aaron Brockovich was looking for, and it is horribly cancerous. It is very bad for you. And so they were like, I just found out that nobody's monitoring this in drinking water. Like, what are we going to do? And I flippantly, without even thinking, said like, well, I mean, you analyze for total chromium, so why would that matter? And they were like, well, because it's hexavalent chromium. I'm like, yeah, but that's silly. Like, you don't need to analyze from a constituent if you've got the total. And it took me a while to realize that they had no idea what I was talking about, right? And more importantly, that me just dismissing their concerns was legitimately upsetting them, right? Like they, even though they did not have a good scientific reason to be upset, they still were upset. And to your point, right, is you need to treat that as though, even though like there's no scientific basis for it, you still need to look at it from their point of view, see that the understanding isn't there, and then work towards educating them. It in my opinion, this is really bad because it erodes faith in science, right? Because when somebody doesn't understand something, they're like, well, I don't understand this. And then you're like, well, because you just don't understand it, and shut up, don't worry about it. Go eat your food, or go, work in the mines or whatever, right? And because of that, because of not being able to see it from the other person's perspective, sometimes it can cause people to be more dismissive, and by extension, damage the reputation of science and scientists as a whole. And sometimes it'll go all the way to making them feel like, oh, they're an elite group that we shouldn't listen to at all. Not that we saw that at all during the pandemic. So,
but I like that one can get you from both sides, because it can make you think you know things, like make you be dismissive when in fact you are wrong, and also make you be dismissive when you are right, which doesn't get your point across, which is that you are an authority on the subject. So like it can screw you both ways.
Absolutely. Number 3. I think you know this one, because we're going to start to get into the ones where they are so bad that everyone knows about them. So,
well, thanks for setting the price high.
You're welcome. Part of me wanted to just say availability heuristic again.
Wait, I remember that recently. It was very important.
Anchoring bias.
Oh, yeah. So the version of this that I am most familiar with, where I actually use the term like anchor for it, is with anchor pricing. So you tell someone, hey, I'm selling this new car and it's normally $1 billion, but I'll sell it to you for just 100,000. And your stupid dumb monkey brain is like, whoa, that's so many less than $1 billion. And then you lose sight of like, is it actually worth even 100,000? Can I afford 100,000? Right? Like you are anchored to the super high price, and then the price that it is being, marked down to seems like such a discount. This happens basically every year on like the Black Friday, Cyber Monday time, where they're like, oh, this thing's on sale for 50% off. And if you check the historical prices, you can see that the week before they doubled the price. It's like, oh, it's on sale for the normal full price. Right. And but again, to your point about like, even when you know about biases, like it's so hard to not be like, but it's 90% off. That's so many off.
That's 90%. I mean, that's a lot off. Yes. And also too, our brains also can anchor to different things. For example, like if the first thing you read on a menu is a $19 hot dog, you're like, oh my God, like the food's so expensive here. But look, they've got like a $15 hamburger. That seems pretty reasonable. And it's like, actually a $15 hamburger is kind of expensive, but compared to a $19 hot dog, well, that's a great deal, So to your point, all types of economic exploits to this one. Within science, it's one of the examples is like, well, the likely cause of problem A is cause B because of trait C, right? So, for example, like, oh, well, the problem with all of the violence these days is kids playing too many video games, right? And now we have anchored onto that problem. And we're like, this is a problem. And more specifically, this is a problem that we need to spend resources to fix. And resources, as we all know, are finite. Another example of this is conservatism bias, which I thought was kind of interesting, which is the tendency to insufficiently revise one's beliefs when presented with new evidence, right? So, when all of a sudden somebody comes and says, hey, so a good example is miasma, right? It's just like, oh, well, obviously the poisonous gases are the things that make people sick. And it's like, actually, I've got a bunch of data that says you shouldn't poop near wells. And it's like, okay, but that's what causes the miasma, right? It's like, no, but that's not a thing.
Yeah. I think the phrase that I think of when I hear like a conservative bias is well, that's the way we've always done it.
Yep.
And
Yep.
a long time ago, I worked with someone who used to say that a lot. And I was venting about them to a colleague, and I shouldn't have. This was a younger, brasher me, but we were getting ready to go into a meeting where we had to make like a big team decision. And I was like, I swear to God, if they say that's the way we've always done it, I'm going to burn this building down. Like I was so soured on the entire, like even trying to solve problems, because I knew there was someone who was suffering from this bias, right? Where they just felt like nothing can ever be different because it's always been the way it always has been. And it's like, God, that's not number one for bad science. Like that's holy moly.
That's only number 3. I got worse ones. Yeah, don't be wrong. Don't get me wrong though. It's bad. It's real bad, right? I can also see though, like kind of where it comes from in the human psyche, because it's like, hey, if we've always done it that way, you know what that hasn't done? Gotten us killed. So like if we keep doing it that way, it won't get us killed. It's like, yeah, but it will get you killed the exact same amount that it always has. If you want to be less killed, we got to try new things. So again, one of the other reasons why our brains were not made for all of the stuff that we're trying to do. But the nice thing is, now that we're aware of it, we're immune to it. So that's fine.
Yeah. I remember hearing recently that's how that worked.
Number 2, association fallacy. So what do we think that is?
I want to say, and if I'm wrong, this will be wrong in a really meta way. Is that like the correlation causation bias? Like these two things are associated, so you are assuming that one caused the other.
That is a type of association fallacy. There is a whole bunch of them, but yes, that would be one of them, where it's like, oh well, I associate these two things together, therefore there is a connection. More specifically, the tendency to create associations that are not real or appropriate. So like even if you say, like, oh well, these two things correlate, it's like, yeah, so by extension they are causal. It's like, well, no, you're associating causation with correlation, which you famously should not do. And I just, on a side note, I do love all of the different, because it's so easy to come up with like some bizarre correlations that obviously have no causal effect. And I play a mini game every time somebody uses that logical fallacy or that cognitive bias. Can I come up with a new correlation that has nothing to do with anything and is obviously true? And the one that I would always fall back on if I couldn't come up with one on the spot is, there are more PlayStation 5s in the world than ever before, and human lifespan is longer than it's ever been. Therefore, PlayStation 5s increase human lifespan, and it's just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, neither is the thing you said, but
Yeah. Are we not just both making crap up? I'm sorry. I thought that's what we were doing. There's a website I will send you that's like spuriouscorrelations.com or something. And it is literally just like any two, because they have a bunch of raw data. And so you can just do math to find correlations and then label them with what those trends are. So it'll be something like number of Atlantic salmon, measured by marine biologists to like frequency of release of Nicolas Cage movies. And it's like, oh man, the salmon population has gone down as we've had fewer and fewer Nicolas Cage movies.
We got to get Nick Cage on those movies.
Yeah.
We got to do something right now.
Yeah. It's just like a huge collection of those.
One of the other ones that I go to, because some of them can actually sound legit. One of them that I would always use is people are like, oh, well, people who spend a lot of time around horses and own horses tend to live like much longer, healthier lives. And that's a strong correlation. And that feels that it confirms our existing biases, right? Like that feels like, oh yeah, because being around horses can be very soothing and relaxing, and they're such majestic beasts and so on and so forth. It's like, or maybe if you can afford horses, you can afford good health care. Like maybe money's the third factor that's not on your little graph there,
Yes. I think you could probably call this the like pop science article fallacy because like almost every time you read like a 3-paragraph article that's like, scientists found a correlation between Nick Cage movies and the number of Atlantic salmon. And it's like, yes, those two data sets follow the same like trend line, but if we increase, did anyone do an experiment to see if giving him another movie did we actually test to see if this is a thing we could have an impact on, or that we could use to make useful, like meaningful predictions? And you're probably right to cite like health horses as the genre of pop science that this bias most commonly takes place in, because there's like this kind of diet, like Japanese people eat a lot of fish, so fish must make you immortal, and Africans walked 10 miles a day 1,000 years ago, so that must make you immortal, right? Like just taking one fact and another fact and then just magically extrapolating. And my favorite like reversal of that is because I am Mediterranean, so there's a part of the Mediterranean that was famous for having an unusual number of people who lived a very long time. And so when we were young adults, you and I, the Mediterranean diet was actually a really big deal.
Oh yeah.
And I remember thinking like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like the part of the world I'm from, like those people may have had like a healthier diet, and like maybe that has helped me, be like the great grandson of really healthy people. And then they found out that part of the world was also famous for retirement fraud. So people were lying about how old they were because it had to do with the way they collected their pension from the government. And maybe more than the beans and the bread, that was making people live unnaturally long lives. And I think about that all the time because I fell victim to it. I wanted to believe it, and it affected me. And so I was like, yeah, that agrees with my pre-existing hopes for my life.
Exactly, right? One of the other biases, though, that falls under this association bias is authority bias, which is that you attribute accuracy to an opinion of an authority figure regardless of content or context. And that's one that, again, a lot of the times it is purely well-meaning, right? But I have two good examples of that. One is that, like, Bill Nye, I love Bill Nye to death. He's great. I believe he has a degree in like environmental sciences or something like that.
Yeah. He's got like a bachelor's in something and then a lifetime of experience, but he has his time spent in academia is actually fairly limited.
Right. And that's the thing is that like, so, I love listening to him about like the stars and about like all of these other things, but he's not an expert, like he's a good science communicator, but like, if you really want to know about a thing and you're like, well, Bill Nye said thing A, it's like, he might be mistaken. Now, Bill Nye would be also one of the first people to say, I might be mistaken about this, So I don't think that he'd like thump his chest and be like, I'm Bill Nye, damn it. But
Bill Nye, the science man.
I am no longer, I've reached the level beyond that of Bill Nye, the science guy. I am now Bill Nye, the science god.
I'd watch that anime.
I was going to say that's the shonen version of Bill Nye the Science Guy. Yep. But anyways, the other great example I think about this is, I'm a chemist, not a scientist. This whole podcast is basically authority bias, right? And
don't you go undermining our premise.
But that's actually part of why when we were like, forging this idea is I was like, we need to have some type of a disclaimer at the front saying, I'm just a chemist. Please take everything I say with a grain of salt. I am not an authority. Please don't mistake me for one.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's association fallacy / authority bias was number 2.
So two quick things. One, in the future, when someone asks, when did the premise of the show become about the premise of the show? The answer will be in the low 30s.
Nice.
And the other thing is I'm actually really kind of fascinated by how many of these have like a broader category. And then some of the versions of them that I was familiar with had like somehow broken out into like the common consciousness. Because lexicon and hierarchies are interesting, but like, it's just, I'm realizing that we've been talking about this, how many of these I just assumed were kind of like their own thing. And it's like, some of them are, but a lot of them are kinds of this broader thing because that's how hierarchies work. It's like,
yep.
Yes, Yes, obviously, yes. Yes, okay, that is how that works.
Yeah. Well, and actually, and I forgot to mention it. So why is this bad? Obviously, because it causes a loss of faith in science because it's like, oh well, Bill Nye said thing A and Bill Nye was wrong, and he's a scientist, so therefore scientists are uneducated or don't really know what they're talking about. It's like, no, that individual did not know what they were talking about. And again, good scientists will all the time say like, oh yeah, I was wrong, I was mistaken, I misspoke, you know. But you know, when you have somebody who's like, oh well, I'm a chemist, but you know, I'm going to talk about the Higgs boson and then I get it wrong. And it's just like, oh, well, man, if he was wrong about that, maybe he's wrong about other things. And it's like, well, probably the closer you get to my area of study, the less likely that I am wrong. But, you know, so it does cause that erosion of faith in science to where people are like, well, you know, person A said thing A wrong. I can also say wrong things. I'm also an authority, you know, which can also be a problem.
Well, I can imagine that happening like on a team or within a community as well, right? Where like I think you're right that the larger population loses faith in science is a super real problem that we are dealing with big time. But on like a very much
sorry, I just pictured you writing a book and it says loss of faith in science, super big problem, big time. Like it's like the undertag line.
A Stephen King novel.
Yep.
Yes, but I think like within a team, you could easily imagine some like say for I don't know whatever reason you have like a team of chemists and a team of geologists, right? And you, a chemist, are talking about a problem with a geologist, and you know Dr. Smith is like, oh well that chemistry thing, blah 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 blah, and you accept that as correct because that person is a doctor of science, but different science, right? And then later, you could also fall into the trap you're describing where it turns out that Dr. Smith was wrong. And you're like, well, I guess Dr. Smith is an idiot. And it's like, no, that Dr. Smith was opining on a subject that is not their own.
Right. And actually, while we're talking about examples, this makes me think of one story that I want to
really
tell
hope you
again.
Do not work with a Dr. Smith, by the way.
I mean, out of all the names you could have picked, that would have been one of the more likely ones I could be working with.
Yes, yes.
So no, it was at one point we studied kung fu together, right? And our sifu was a great sifu of kung fu, an authority of kung fu, one might say, not an authority in other areas. And at one point, somebody was doing inverted push-ups, so handstand push-ups.
It was me, and because I remember the look on your face, but I was upside down, and your face screwed up in such consternation.
Because somebody, so you were doing the vertical push-ups, right? And somebody nearby said, "Hey Sifu, why is it so much harder to do push-ups like that?" Now, my understanding is because your center of gravity is so much further off of the ground that even smaller changes in how you're pushing causes you to have harder corrections, right? And so I was kind of thinking about it, and then Sifu said, "Oh, well, you're further away from the Earth, so gravity's pulling on you harder." And I remember in that moment being like, oh no, that's so wrong. But he's the authority in this school and I can't correct him. But that's so wrong and so obviously wrong. And apparently, as I was having all of those thoughts was when you looked at me and started laughing and could no longer do the push-ups.
Yeah, I fell down.
All right. Number 1, confirmation bias.
Yeah. Oldie but a goodie. Still out there breaking hearts.
You want to take a swing at this one?
Yeah, I mean the colloquial way for sure of confirmation bias showing up is well there's like right about one thing, right about everything, right? Kind of the opposite of what we were just talking about. Because I was right about this, I will be right about the next thing. But also you make a prediction, right? I think that I will find a heads up penny in this part of the parking lot, and you do, and then you assume that there will always be heads up pennies in this part of the parking lot, or every parking lot has a heads up penny because you have one thing or a small sample of things that confirm the thing you think, and then you just assume that, oh, this is always true. I found 2 examples of it. What do you need? 3 examples? Look, I found 3 examples. Obviously, this always works 100% of the time. There's no variability ever.
Right. Which could lead to scope neglect, which is a type of extension neglect. Um, it's like poetry. These sort of things rhyme.
Yeah, they rhyme.
But so specifically, confirmation bias is so you nailed it. You got it right. The tendency to search for, focus on, or interpret and remember confirming information. Right. So one of the examples, which is a subset of confirmation bias, is the backfire effect, which we all know and love, which is it strengthens your existing beliefs when you're actually given disconfirming information. So like when all of a sudden it's like, to your point, right, where it's like, oh, well, I'm the master of picking up pennies. I picked up 3 pennies, and there's was a penny in every parking lot that I went to. Therefore, every parking lot has a penny, and it's like, well, I'm John Smith, and I picked up 10 pennies, and none of them were in parking lots. And it's like, oh, well, that's just random error. Like that can't be right, like because obviously my thing is correct, So you tend to hand wave away that like, oh, well, yes, that's a fact, but that's anecdotal. And it's like, it could be, but it's as valid as your thing, So, and again, like scope neglect can be an issue there where it's just like, oh, well, I had well, you want a third example? And it's like, well, this person has 20 examples of their thing. And it's like, yeah, but I lived through 3 of mine. So your data does not confirm my data. So I'm going to hand wave that away,
Would this also encompass, is confirmation bias what you would also call it when you take a measurement of the thing you want to be true? You see that it is that, and then you assume that must be correct, right? I want to be able to draw an ace of spades so that I can win with a royal flush and be Maverick. So because I did that, I must be magic because I was able to reach into the heart of the cards. And you know what I mean? Like, is that also confirmation bias? Is like, I have one measurement that says the thing I want to be true is true. So I'm just going to do no other checking.
Yes. That would be, in my opinion, that would be an example of confirmation bias. Also that would happen. I believe a more common version of it would be, I'm magic and can magically draw the ace of spades, and then you draw a card and you're like, doesn't count. The ace of spades, I am magic, That would be an example of the backfire effect, right? I have 20, I have 51 examples of me not being magic. But that 52nd example.
I did it. I can draw the ace of spades in between 1 and 52 tries.
Exactly.
Every time.
Nailing it. Every time. 2% of the time, it works every time. Yes. Another example of confirmation bias is expectation bias. And I feel like this is actually one of the more insidious ones, which is the tendency to believe, certify, or publish agreeing data. So what that means is, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, which is that we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. And the thing that has made this, in my opinion, and the reason why I ranked it number 1 is because of the both beautiful benefit and horrible detriment that is a Google search engine, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that's the problem, is that it's just like you can easily find tons of information that confirm your existing beliefs, and then that further entrenches you. And then when somebody does come to you with additional information that maybe isn't subject to scope neglect or the availability heuristic or anchoring bias or any of the other logical fallacies we've discussed, this is good pure information, you're more likely to say like, but I've got like 20 sources that agree with me. And it's like, yes, but you have not considered the nature of those sources. They simply confirm your existing beliefs, which makes all of a sudden the reason why we're seeing measles outbreaks again. Like it can become so damaging to, and especially when you do have people who are, falling prey to the authority bias, right? Where all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I found 5 examples of scientists agreeing with me. And it's like, yeah, but no one agrees with them,
Or this business leader has said I shouldn't get my kids vaccinated. It's like, even if they were the businessiest business person in all of Businessington, that doesn't mean they know anything about health and wellness. Like there's, oh God.
Yeah,
We're screwed.
Way
We're screwed.
to nail
We're
that,
so
by
screwed.
the way. Yeah. the business person in all of Businessington. Oh, that's hard to say, man. Like, well done.
Thank you. There was a stumble at the beginning, but I got it.
Yeah, and I stumbled in the middle. So, therefore, 100% of people stumble anytime they try to say that word every time.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, confirmed. Yes. We took measurements.
Absolutely. Look, no, we need to worry about the scope of the experiment. Just believe it. So yeah, and to your point, right, is that like, is that when you kind of take all of these, the all of them together, and the honorable mentions, is you're kind of like, it is nothing short of a minor miracle that we've gotten as far as we have, right? And one of the tacit reasons why I wanted to do this, right, is because I find all of these very frustrating. I find it frustrating when other people do it. I find it frustrating for myself when I do them. But more importantly is that these aren't the problems of people who are educated or uneducated, or people who are specialists or not specialists. These are human problems, and we are all subject to them. So whenever you see somebody exhibiting one of these, maybe try to like coax them back into, like, point it out, but don't just immediately discount them and be like, oh, well, they're not a good scientist. They're not thinking about this scientifically because they fell prey to this one thing, because that would be a fallacy in and of itself. It's the G.I. Joe, bias, right? So, like, keep in mind that we are all a whole bunch of things that turn oxygen into carbon dioxide, and we're all on a giant ball of mud spinning through the universe at thousands of miles an hour. So, just take a breath and let's all imagine each other complexly, be a little kind, and know that we are all susceptible to these cognitive biases.
Which does actually remind me of another bias I wanted to ask you about.